Good morning. We'll call the meeting to order. We have a quorum. First item on the agenda is that we are audio and video recording.
I can just read the statement, Chair. Board members, staff, guests, and members of the public are reminded that the full authority board committee meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the authority's website along with the official written minutes. As such, comments and opinions expressed may be published, and any comments expressed by individual board members, guests, and the general public are their own and do not represent the opinions or comments of the full authority and or the KCC Board of Directors. The recorded video of the full authority meeting is not considered the official record of the meeting. The official record of the full authority meeting shall consist solely of the minutes approved by the full authority.
Thank you. The next item is introductions and declarations of pecuniary interest. Since we're all not here for our first time, we'll move right along. Next, we have the minutes of the meeting.
That the minutes of the February 8th, 2023 full authority meeting and the February 22nd, 2023 annual general meeting be approved.
Moved by Jim Herbert, seconded by Sam. Any discussion? Seeing none. Elizabeth?
The chair, all the members here are present, so we can do a show of hands for a change if we don't want to do a recorded vote. It would make the meeting go faster.
Thank you. Everyone all right with that? Thank you. All those then in favor? Item carries. Next item is matters arising from the minutes. Elizabeth?
No matters arising, but we can start with the media report, and it's the will of the board. I'll just mesh all of these reports together and then pause for questions. So the media report was put out in the advanced package. Lots of fun things happening at the authority, some volunteer events down at Lake Margaret, and of course staff are busy at this time of year gearing up for the campgrounds opening with seasonal staff postings and looking for tree planting sites as well as wetland creation sites. Next slide. We did on March 15th open our website up for new seasonal campers. The seasonal camper application goes live at 9 a.m. and this year our website crashed because of the interest there. So you can see on the graph what a normal day would be. Users on our site about 200 say, and at the peak at 9 a.m. there was about, that's 1,500, almost 2,000 page views at one time. So that's basically people sitting on that application, refreshing until it comes up and wanting to get their application in. So a good sign of just how popular our campgrounds are, and staff will be taking measures so that hopefully we have a little bit more memory on our website so that we don't have a crash again next year. Next slide. Watershed conditions. Jen isn't able to make the meeting today, but the water levels throughout the watershed and in Lake Erie are currently higher than normal and are fluctuating with the rain thaw events that we're seeing. 1 week snow, when the next week it's raining. So it's been an interesting spring, but obviously not one that has as yet a real heightened level of flood concern. Things seem to be behaving themselves. But we did issue some watershed condition statements in February, and a safety bulletin was put out for the March break as well. Next slide. Diversity, equity, and inclusion report. The vice chair did ask us to update board members on what we are doing in terms of calls to action and introducing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our board meetings. Staff continue to work through this. We are taking our time. We want to do it right. We have reached out to Cambian Indigenous Professional Services. They're working with us to come up with a plan that involves both training and some exercises that we can do as a staff. Some of that will be hopefully be able to accomplish this year, and we'll also be building this into the 4-year budget cycle as well. Staff and generally have denoted an increased desire for training and consultation, and so that's what we're working through. We do have a drafted land acknowledgement, but we feel it's important to build connections with the Indigenous community and have their input into that land acknowledgement as well. So this is the first report that we have for you, but we'll definitely be bringing back reports and hope to have additional information for you in April. Next slide. The CAF quarterly progress report, as you know, this is a quarterly report that we need to submit to MECP. This is detailing the progress that we've made on the Conservation Authority Act changes. To be honest, between the period of January and the end of March, there hasn't been a lot of progress made on these initiatives, mainly because we've taken the time to bring on a new board, finish year end and things of that nature. We will be working in this next quarter to look at the apportionment agreement and get that out to member municipalities. So expect that things will pick up in this next quarter. Next. And those are the reports under matters arising, and the motion would be that those reports be received, but I would entertain questions as well.
Thank you. Questions or comments?
Yeah, just a question. I think it is in the, is it the watershed conditions where you rate everything? A, B, C, D?
That's in the watershed report card that's coming up later in the
Okay,
agenda.
so then I won't, I don't have any.
Any further questions? Motion to accept the report?
Sorry, Sharon moved,
And
and Sam as the seconder.
further questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Item carries unanimously. Next item, please. Correspondence.
Correspondence, it was just the letter that was forwarded out by Rob Flack following a meeting that we had with him. I think it was a positive letter. We haven't heard any response back from the ministry as of yet for the London reps, but hopefully Mr. Flack's letter will speed that up.
Questions or comments? Go ahead, John.
It was, I also thought it was a very productive meeting with Rob. It was, it's nice to see some common sense. Hopefully that follows through as it has a change.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from those in attendance? Once again, thank you all for attending.
So we just have a motion that the correspondence be received.
Todd? And John, thank you. Further questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Item carries. Next item, please. Statement of revenue and expenses.
There's no report under that item for this month.
Next is new business, automated payments.
Sure, staff continue to move our vendors to electronic invoices and payments as much as we can. We have seen that there's some vendors that don't allow for EFT payments, but will allow for automatic bank withdrawals. And staff, and again, that effort to move away from checks and to a full electronic accounting system, we're recommending that the following vendors be moved to automatic bank withdrawals. Those are Bell, both Bell, Mother Bell, and then Bell Mobility. The City of St. Thomas accepts automatic bank withdrawals for taxes, as well as the City of London. And MNP is our outsourced accounting. So that's a standard bill every month. So the recommendation is just that the Board of Directors approve the updates. Sorry, that's the wrong motion. That the Board of Directors approve those automated bank withdrawals for the vendors outlined in the staff report.
Jim? Questions or comments? Jim?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just wondering, when you say staff, what staff are we talking about? The whole management staff, or just yourself, Elizabeth, or when you say staff?
Making the recommendation,
Pardon?
making the recommendation.
Yeah, but is it, was the decision just when administration made that, or everybody have input into it?
Jessica is our main bookkeeper, in-house bookkeeper right now, so it's a decision between her and I that are making that
Okay, that's
recommendation.
fine, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Item carries. Next is the conservation area fees update.
I'll turn this over to Jill.
Right, thank you. So as outlined in the advanced report, staff is recommending a minor update to our 2023 conservation area fees for our campgrounds. These fees were originally approved in October of 2022, prior to us making the decision to move forward with automated gate controls. So as we're now working through preparing for implementation of those controls, part of that process is our seasonal campers and our seasonal day use who have access to the park for the entire season will be issued a proximity card, which is basically like a credit card that you hold within 4 inches of the reader and it controls the gate. With that, there is some expense to the Conservation Authority in acquiring those cards. So we are looking at recommending increasing our seasonal day use fee and our seasonal additional vehicle fee by $10 to accommodate that cost. So right now it's $90. We did not increase that fee when we reviewed it in October, and we're recommending now that we increase that fee for the 2023 so that the cost of the car is covered by the user. So as in the report, the recommendation is that we increase our seasonal day use fee to $100 from $90, our additional vehicle pass to $100 from $90, and that we add a new fee category for replacement of loss or damage proximity cards for $20. The only other thing I would note there is with our seasonal camper agreement, that includes 2 seasonal passes for their vehicles. We're not recommending at this time to increase those fees for the seasonal agreements. That'll be included with their current rate that they've paid. So we are just looking for approval of the changes to the 2023 conservation area fees as presented.
We get a mover and a seconder. We'll have a discussion. Even seconder, Todd. Thank you. Questions or comments? Go ahead, please.
So do people establish a camp like a trailer and leave it there all year?
Yeah.
And do that, okay?
Yeah, so we have 2 categories. We have our, what we refer to as transient or short term. They come in for the weekend or the week, but we do have a select number of sites that are designated for seasonals. So we have an application process and then they get certain privileges because they site their trailer for the entire camping season.
Just to follow on, I looked at the fees, I haven't camped in years.
Right.
It was way cheaper then.
Yeah.
But it looks like based on the demand for stuff, the fees must be acceptable to people. They just seem, well, everything's getting out there, isn't it?
Right. We certainly, we do a comparison with other neighboring CAs in Southwestern Ontario. We always try to keep our fee competitive, but in the mid-range. So we're not the lowest fees in the province and we're not necessarily the highest. We're an appropriate fee range that we believe.
It's a good strategy.
Councilor Herbert.
Through the chair, I'm gonna assume when you have the season, you're responsible for maintenance on the site. And keeping it clean.
So under the seasonal agreement, the seasonal campers are responsible for cutting their own grass. So they are permitted to have a shed and they keep their own equipment in the shed. The biggest issues with that is that decision I believe was made many years ago because there's lots of like extension cords or things like that we don't know where seasonals have necessarily placed them. So to avoid our staff going in and damaging equipment, it's set up in the agreement that the seasonal camper is responsible for cutting the grass on their own site.
Do you allow for a lot of extension cords laying on the ground everywhere?
Well, there's certainly rules and regulations that they have to follow and there's approvals that they have to get, but sometimes those things aren't necessarily seen. So that's been set up to just to avoid staff damaging personal property.
Because years ago when we camped, you pull into a campsite, and there'd be 12 hookups to the same thing and they're laying everywhere. I didn't know if that's.
Over the years, as we've been doing site setups, we try and avoid those cluster posts. So now new electrical posts are 1 per campsite to help minimize that. Yeah, to minimize the risk. So,
Thank you.
yeah, I think the other point was when we maintain grass cutting with the short terms, we have an opportunity to cut the grass as they leave before the next person comes in. So the seasonal's fully set up. It makes the arrangement. There's certainly lots of benefits the seasonals get for having a site, but there's also benefits we get by having them as well. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe, just one question. Do they have to remove their vehicle during the winter?
Yeah.
Off-site storage?
Yeah, a few years ago, we made the decision to no longer off-season storage. Primarily, especially when we look at St. Thomas and its proximity to the city, we were experiencing significant vandalism over the off-season break-ins and theft and damage. So a few years ago, the supporting the decision to no longer permit off-season trailer storage. A little bit of struggle in the beginning, but it's pretty well receptive now and people understand and accept it. So it hasn't hurt the interest as you've seen by the report earlier today. So
When do the parks open then for?
yeah, our operating hours are May 1st to September 30th. So we operate for 5 months.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Anyone else have any further questions or comments? The only thing then from the chair that I would like to hear is communicated feedback from the actual users to see how they like and enjoy the addition of the gate. So
Yes.
that information becomes available.
Certainly, we can prepare that. I know we haven't formally announced it yet. We were waiting for a few of the procedural matters to be in place. But just based on some prior interest and feedback, we know that there's interest from a lot of our users to have more controlled entry in the park. So we're not anticipating like anything. I think there'll be positive and negative, and we'll certainly report on that once we go through it.
I was thinking that it would all be in the positive.
I think we just need a show of hands on
All
that
right.
motion. I
On
think.
that motion, we have a mover and seconder. All those in favor? That item carries. Next item, please. Floodplain mapping.
So yeah, Chair Jennifer Dow was unable to make the meeting today, so I'm going to cover this report. The floodplain mapping RFP, we did receive funding from the federal proposal, and we're successful in obtaining $56,000, which matched to $65,000 that we had allocated in the budget for a total project cost of $117,000. This project will update our riverine and flood hazard mapping, basically in the Dodd Creek subwatershed for about a 24-kilometer square area. And it provides also an opportunity to update portions of the St. Thomas Flood Damage Center mapping as well. So it's a great opportunity, and because we're getting matching funds, it makes our available resources go further. So staff released the RFP on February 6th and closed on February 27th. We received 4 bids, which I thought was a good reflective and competitive bidding process. Aquifer Beach did come in with a proposal that was the best technical proposal, as well as offered the lowest rate, and we're proposing to go ahead with Aquifer Beach for this project. And I just have the next slide, Marianne. We are asking the board at this time to maintain an upset limit for the project of $117,000 to ensure that we can do some final negotiations with Aquifer Beach for the scope of work and ensure for any contingencies. We'll report back to the chair and vice chair on what the final proposal is and the agreed upon document. But the recommendation that I have for you today is that the contract for the KCC Enhanced Riverine Floodplain Mapping be awarded to Aquifer Beach with an upset limit of 117, including applicable taxes to allow for final determination of project scope and contingencies.
Thank you. Can I get a mover and a seconder on the recommendation? Then we'll have discussion with Frank and then talk. Questions or comments? Jim?
To the chair, I'd like a little more information on who Aquifer Beach is, Aquifer Beach. Are they local somewhere in the world? I just like some more information on them.
Yeah, they're not local, but they're a well-known and respected engineering firm from across the province. Within their proposal, they gave references that showed that they've done projects like this in the past, and Jen did follow up with some reference calls to other CAs that have used them, and they came back glowing.
Because when you go from top to bottom, it's $25,000 difference that they're proposing. I see it'd be great if any 2 points because you're asking them all the same questions. I never heard of them. Are they? Oh, where are they located?
I
It's the Waterloo region.
think so, yeah.
Where?
Waterloo.
Oh, Waterloo. Oh, so.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted information I've never heard of.
Yeah, and we have followed up with the federal funding, offered up engineers as well so we've spoken with them about the proposals as well, and they agreed that Aquifer Beach offered the best proposal.
So through chair, follow-up question.
But
1 year contract you're talking?
Yeah, the work needs to be done by March 31st, 2024. So it's not really a year contract, it's a project.
Project completed. Thank you.
Further questions or comments? John?
And just to, Chair, anytime you can get double your bang for your buck, it's a great opportunity to have it when someone else is for half the bill, so that's if it's required stuff we have to do and it's half covered, fantastic.
Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, then a show of hands, all those in favor. Item carries. Next item, please, the watershed report card.
So Chair, this is the 2023 watershed report card. It reports on the watershed health using 4 resource categories that staff have looked at collecting information and environmental monitoring data over the last 5 years. We report every 5 years on it. This report card includes data up to 2022. It uses the template that was designed by Conservation Ontario, so there's some consistency across the province in terms of the numbers and the grade categories that you're looking at. The watershed report card background document that was included in your advanced packages also provides the background detail in terms of how Jennifer came up with the letter grades and the technical aspects that she uses to evaluate the different categories. The watershed report card itself is available online and in other formats upon request. Next slide. So just to give you a high level detail of this, this is the surface water quality. In terms of surface water quality, we were given a D grade when you look at it. The D grade is mainly because almost 100% of our phosphorus samples over the last 5 years have exceeded the provincial water quality objective. And that's very characteristic of the watershed itself, because as we've talked before, some of their defining watershed issues are sedimentation and erosion in terms of surface water runoff and low oxygen levels throughout the watershed as well. Next slide. This map shows you the current forest conditions in the watershed. Currently, we have a forest cover of 14.15%, which is less than half of what is recommended by Environment and Climate Change for a healthy and biodiverse watershed. So in a watershed, you typically would like to see 30% forest cover. So again, that kind of explains the D grade. Again, for the watershed itself, we're seeing tree planting loss or forest cover loss, mainly due to agricultural practices, but also development. There's a certain amount of die-off due to the impacts of invasive species and erosion. But this map certainly underlines when we talk about the authority planting 50,000 trees per year, it certainly underlines the necessity of programs like that to not only increase forest cover, but just to maintain the forest cover that we currently have. Next slide. This is the map for groundwater quality. It's our only A grade, and it's a good indication that the groundwater is in good condition, but it's certainly still vulnerable to negative impacts from human actions. So we still need to optimize fertilizer application and regularly maintain septic systems to ensure that we maintain that grade throughout the watershed. Next slide. The final reporting category is wetland cover. So in the watershed currently, we have 2.49% wetland habitat. So that ranges from an F grade in the upper portions of the watershed to slightly more favorable grade in the lower kettle D. It's still extremely low wetland cover throughout the watershed. Environment Canada recommends about 10% wetland cover in a watershed. So we still have work that can be done in terms of wetland creation as well. Next slide. So the public facing watershed report card not only details those maps, but it also details the way that the Conservation Authority is attempting to raise those grades and what we've done over the last 5 years. A lot of that was highlighted in the annual reports, but just a few highlights there. The Algonquin Clean Water Program is definitely a boost to our water quality, with total project costs now exceeding $1 million. It's a great opportunity for the authorities to work with willing landowners to do wetland creation and other stewardship and best management practices to improve water quality throughout the watershed. Forestry, as I mentioned, over the last 5 years, we planted over 219,000 native trees, shrub seedlings across the watershed. That really needs to be maintained, if not increased, to have it to sustain the forest cover that we have, if not increase it. Wetlands, we made a commitment over 5 years ago that was one area that we wanted to commit to see if we can have a direct impact on the landscape. Betsy, through her various funding opportunities, we've restored 30 acres of wetlands and adjacent habitat between 2019 and 2021. We've implemented 22 wetland creation projects and eradicated over 15 acres of invasive species. Education awareness is also important. So the Kettle Creek Environmental Youth Corps concentrates on building knowledge and awareness specifically with our high school students, and gets them involved in meaningful work on the landscape as well to teach that next generation about what's necessary to improve the health of our watershed. So next slide. So with that, the recommendation is that the 2023 watershed report card and the background report be approved as presented. Staff will be launching this as part of the larger Conservation Ontario movement for World Water Day, and all the rest of the watershed report cards are trying to be released at the same time, both to raise awareness about the health of the watersheds throughout Ontario.
Recommendation is there. Tam, are you moving it?
Yeah, how does this compare with other local districts?
I haven't had a chance really to look at some of the other conservation authorities and their watershed report cards. They're basically being released this week. So it will be interesting to look at those, but I would say, especially in southwestern Ontario, you're probably seeing similar grades throughout the province.
Yeah. And historically, is this similar to what past years have said?
Yeah, the overall grade for the watershed is a C. When you kind of mark out the A, Ds, and the Cs, the overall grade is a C, which is the exact same as to what it was 5 years ago.
The other question is, for purposes of public consumption, I think it might be important because when you look at this on the surface, it might not look really good. And I think it's important that the public understand that there are a variety of different reasons beyond the performance of this administration for that. Do you have any thoughts about how we put that out there for the public? Because I think there are going to be questions about this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I don't think the watershed report card is put out there as a reflection or a metric of what we're doing or what we're accomplishing. It's more of a snapshot in time of the health of the watershed. I certainly look at a C grade as certainly it's status quo. No one ever wants to see this. I wouldn't want to see a report card like this from my kids at home. But I think it's reflective of, you can look at it as a way is that we are maintaining status quo, which is an achievement in itself, considering the development pressures that we do have in southwestern Ontario, and underlines that we can't be complicit in terms of what is happening on the landscape, because there is more that needs to be done, and there is resources that need to be directed to it.
Thank you. I think that's a very important message that I hope our communications staff puts out there.
Agreed.
Okay, Frank?
Yeah, I have a few questions. Okay, so to Sam's point, humans are the problem, Sam. Our impact on the environment. I don't know how you're gonna deal with that. I've seen a few other report cards that are about in the zone of poor, we're hanging on. My question is maintaining forest cover. Are we maintaining it with the trees we're planting? Or do we need to up that?
I would say definitely we need to up it. The last watershed report card that we put out, we tried to do an analysis on just are we keeping keeping pace. At 50, the estimate from staff is that at planting 50,000 trees, we're just keeping pace with what's being lost, either from human consumption destruction or from invasive species and things like that. So if we want to see real gain, we have to at least maintain or increase.
So maybe sometime in the future, we'll look at upping that to something, if you can, there's a cost, right? You have to buy the trees and then volunteers
Yeah.
plant them. I'll just park that there, and I mean, it's something we have to consider maybe going forward. Everybody's in the same boat.
Chair, if I could just, before Frank goes on to your next voice, just to add to that, tree planting, if you remember the categories that the province has asked us to set out, tree planting is not considered a mandatory service of this authority. So I'm glad to hear that response from you, that you would agree that tree planting is important and that we should be looking at increases. But that has to come from our member municipalities as well, because for this authority to maintain that program, if not increase it, we'll be looking for municipalities to support that, as well as to other funding sources, which this authority has been very successful at in the past in terms of finding matching dollars for every municipal dollar that's put into that program.
Okay, well, I have seen some conservation authorities appear before our council and ask for extra money for certain programs. So if we were okay with it, anyway, just moving on. Can you comment on phosphorus? Is this laundry detergent, fertilizers, or what is it, Joe? I guess I wouldn't be the most appropriate person to comment on that. I think Jen
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Jen, if we can put a tag in that one, I can ask Jennifer Dow to report on that next.
Yeah,
At next meeting.
I just wondered, I think that's what it is.
I think it's a variety of things. I don't think it's one of those things that you can necessarily point to necessarily one source. It's, fertilizers, it's laundry detergents, it's
Yeah.
all of those elements that are contributing to that.
Last question is wetland cover. So how do you create wetland? You purposely flood low areas, or you pick certain areas? Like, how are you doing that?
I'll touch on it a little bit, but Betsy basically works and tries to identify willing landowners, but there's areas within any landscaper. By looking at mapping, you can see where there's low-lying areas or wet, traditionally or historically wet soils. And we would be looking to identify landowners with areas like that to restore it to a natural wetland cover.
Okay, thank you.
Chair.
Go ahead.
It's kind of a twofold question, I guess, was probably the one to answer. You've got a lot of things on the go that are happening. If you show us these graphs again in 5 years, will there be a dent in it? Will we have the same color? And secondly, are there projects that you would like to get done that would help change a lot of those poor areas that you are under restraints, you can't do it because you don't have budgets or staff to do those? So it's kind of a twofold question.
Chair to Jim, if I had a crystal ball, I'd love to say what things are going to look like in 5 years. I can't guarantee that we're pushing this forward. Again, I don't like to necessarily link the watershed report card to the metrics of the performance of this authority. But I think if you're going to push anything forward, tree planting, wetland creation projects are the key thing that we've always said is going to make an impact in this watershed. Our defining characteristics are erosion, and wetland creation keeps more water on the landscape, slows that water down as it tries to make its way down to Port Stanley. Tree planting is the best way to keep soil on the landscape, and wetlands are natural sponges which will help filter out those phosphorus things. So tree planting and wetland creation, I've always said, is probably the most cost-effective, biggest impact to climate change and the defining characteristics of this watershed. And naturally, those two things are not things that the government has decided are mandatory programs. And so we will be looking for our municipal partnerships to continue that, as well as trying to find matching funding dollars to do the biggest impact.
So you define you're showing us those graphs that, all the work that you guys are doing in 5 years, it may not change on the graph. It might still be 4, it might still be this. That's what you're saying. Realistically, it probably wouldn't change in 5 years. I mean, we wanted to get it better, but,
If I may, I know one comment I'd make is, as much as the efforts the Conservation Authority is doing with reforestation. If you recall, the change to Bill 23 and our mandatory programs, we don't have any role in protecting woodlands. That falls with the municipality bylaws under the act, right? So through tree loss or tree clearing or development impacts, we don't have the ability to require comment on protection of woodland. So it's kind of an unfair balance when we're trying to promote increasing woodland coverage and do tree planting, and on the other end, we're not involved in commenting or reviewing loss of tree covers or providing. So that's the one comment I'd add to that kind of scenario.
so do you have any control over private land, or is it just private?
The only areas that we would have regulatory control where we have approval or a say is with flooding and erosion. So we can, through development, we can try to find ways to reduce phosphorus through road control works and that type of stuff. But when it comes to tree removal or woodlot coverage, it's an unfair test to perceive that we can protect or increase that when we can't control the loss of woodlands in the community. We're just trying to implement programs where we can try and increase it, and at a goal is we're trying to maintain what's currently on the landscape.
I mean, thanks, to follow on to that, you could have a tree preservation policy in your municipality. We do, it doesn't work, because we're constantly under pressure from developers, and especially Bill 23. We just had an incident where we had a council meeting, preserve these trees in this development, they just went in and cut them down. Then what are you gonna do, plant a tree? It'll take, what, 25 years to grow. That's just a comment on that. Okay.
Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a question, it might be a comment. It might not be a very nice one either. So I'm looking at this from the point of view of how it's going to be received by the public and by our municipal partner. And I think it's very clear that the lower grades here are not any reflection on the work of this district. At the same time, it's a reflection of something. And I'm wondering to what degree, and I know that we're very constrained as a district itself, but to what degree can we step up a little bit, even if it's not the authority doing it as the authority, even if it's something that some of us take on with respect to going back to our municipalities. What can we do to up the level of urgency on this? Because as I see it, and this may be overly simplistic, and I'm trying not to be partisan here, but the way I see it is we are being cut off at the knees in terms of being able to do the types of things that we need to be able to do to affirmatively increase its performance. I would very much like to see a delegation of representation. I know that we report to the City of London. And I know the City of London is maybe thought of as except during budget time. I think the City of London may just be sort of a afterthought. But I would like to get a little bit more aggressive with the City of London and challenge them to be a little bit more. And I'm trying to use nice language here. Trying to be a little bit more proactive with their partners in terms of helping us with this. What can we as an authority do, or what can we as members do to increase this? Because I don't like the fact. I understand these numbers, but I do think we have the will, we have the technology, we have the staff to include this, yet we're being told there's certain things that you can't do as an authority. And we have to fight back against that, but we also need to press our municipal partners that they need to pick up. They need to pick up the slack, otherwise we're gonna get more black.
Chair, just to Sam's comment, the City of London is undertaking their 4-year strategic planning now. And one of the things that the boards and commissions were asked to do was to identify things of order of magnitude that the boards and commissions thought were needed to be done to assist the City of London in terms of achieving their strategic goals. What could we add to that? So as a staff, we identified things as part of that process, which included, increasing our invasive species control. That's something that would strategically fit into elements of their plan, but also introducing, we have the Elgin Clean Water Program, going to the City of London and asking them to support a similar program for the City of London portion. So assisting and funding best management practices for private landowners to fit into that, including wetland creation and things of that nature. So there were elements that staff did identify as part of that City of London project, and those things can be, also not manipulated, but presented as to the other member municipalities as things that we can increase. My objective right now is to, as part of the CA Act review, is to at the very least get all of our member municipalities on board that our tree planting program must continue, at the very least a status quo, before we go and start, looking at additions to it.
So how do we, I'm a municipal councillor in London, and I'm feeling my way around in terms of what councillors can and can't do. And one of the big issues that's coming up every day in all of our wards is tree loss. Not because of invasive species and not because of because of infrastructure projects. Because we want to put in cycling lanes, because we want to upgrade our sewers. I think there would be an incredible level of support among Londoners. So you say that this was submitted as part of their strategic plan review. In what form? I'm not challenging you. What I'm challenging here is.
And it wasn't brought to the board. It was part of a staff process. We are under tight timelines to get it to the City of London, but I can certainly share that with board members. And just based on the conversation today, what maybe staff need to do is go back and show you the numbers of what it costs to plant and maintain a status quo program for tree planting, and what we look at in terms of what is capable of increasing that and what impact that would have on our member municipalities. So you can reflect on that as well.
Do you feel as if the strategic plan process in London is absorbing the comments you're making and being mindful of them? Because it is a huge bureaucratic hole.
Yeah, definitely so. We have a good working relationship with the staff there. But like I said, they do operate on tight timelines. So sometimes staff have to, comment on that before we can necessarily bring.
They operate self-imposed timeline. And if they need more time to sort through these things, council's going to be very happy to give them that. I want to make sure that the feedback that is coming from this agency is not just going into a bureaucratic hole, but is being reflected in the actual ongoing process of amendments to our strategic plan. And we're at a very important point right now. I mean, our strategic plan is not done, but it's very close to being done. And if I'm going to say we're sitting there with cement around our feet, that cement is hardening very quickly right now. But I do think there is time for us to up things a little bit. And by the way, this is what's gonna play into our new upcoming 4-year budget in London. And I think that the feedback from this agency could be very useful for those of us around the table, especially some of us new councillors who want to perhaps increase the importance of tree planting and other similar measures. So I think what I'm trying to emphasize here is that you are a very important stakeholder in the city of London. And I want to see the message that I'm hearing around this table be amplified.
Okay.
I appreciate those comments and also that you are sitting around that table, that you are using your voice to advocate for these measures and to include us in the conversation.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
When you're just starting, I mean, it's much harder than I thought.
May I just ask one question?
Yeah, if I could, I think Frank was next and then.
Okay. One of the problems for conservation authorities, they come hand in hand and have to work with municipalities, right? That is a problem. And all of us look at, and I'm just as bad as everyone, what are they increasing fees by? Just, I think, you know, we're at a period in time where maybe action is required in different places. Like in your place, you finally got a homelessness policy that might work after years. We did a 180-degree turnabout. And so that's an action item, but what I would suggest, maybe do we feel out or do you, what are we, Elgin County and Middlesex County? Do you gather with your other conservation authorities and say, I would be supportive of increasing forestation more? Say, maybe it's a feel out, it was a bit of a letter saying, you know, at our board, there seems to be, and we're a board of counselors from everywhere. We would like to put a stab into one thing, which is upping the reforestation thing by whatever. I don't know if we can go 25%. What does that mean from 50 to 75? What does that cost? I think that would be an interesting discussion here. What does it cost? And maybe we try that, say, look, there's an extra fee for reforestation. We think it's important on top of our regular levy. I told you it was Lower Thames came to us and sought quite a bit of money for campground upgrades, play equipment, and I think stuff like that, which we went for. But that would be a step, Sam, where we're doing something positive and we're making a dent in that one area. So that would be a feel out. And then, okay, if we come to you and say, would you be prepared to pay, you know, your levy would increase by this amount, or just be dedicated to reforestation? And we could see over time, what did that take you, 3 years to make a dent in anything with it? Or you could even say that kind of stuff, but that's what I like to do now. You know, I've been on councils before, but there's always a lot of talk, right? And, you know, then there's no action on anything. And here's an opportunity to do some action on something. So I'm making a stab at it, which means we have to support the Kettle Creek with extra money, not unreasonable, but if it's spread out, maybe we can make a dent in reforestation. I think you'd have to go 3 years at that to make a real dent in it and report back and say, look, we're making progress.
For what it's worth, there was absolutely none pushback or negative feedback in terms of the levy request. And which is surprising because we have some real, it was a very positive thing, but there was no pushback at all. It could have been higher.
Thank you. Next comments from Sharon, please.
I just wondered, counselors in Town Center have been approached by a group of people who want to start a tree planting program. So, as we look at that, how much does Kettle Creek go into Town Center, and where, if we were to do something like that, where would be the best place? I mean, this is in a very initial stage, but
Yeah.
If you'd like, I can show.
Point out.
Like in terms of the Town Center of the watershed, if you're familiar with our campground, I mean, we have a small southwestern corner of Town Center. Just so kind of from Avon to Belmont and only up a couple,
okay,
2 concession blocks.
okay, thank you.
But while we would have, you know, a small section, you know, you have other CAs
Yeah.
within your jurisdiction, and I
Right.
would say that they have the, you know, and we work closely together, that we would, you know, be able to do a program like that or deliver whatever it is that that
Right.
group might be looking at or
And
concerned
that
they
would be like next steps, because one of our counselors is a member of the for Thames Conservation Authority. So I'm just trying to look at a fairly broad picture where if we were gonna go where the most effective areas are.
Just to fall into that, we have something called Trees Middlesex.
Yeah.
They provide trees.
Yeah.
We give them a grant. Big on, they plant it in road allowances and you can buy trees at 20 bucks a pop. They're only in forest. That's one thing you could look at, and that's on top of any conservation authority activities.
Well, and similarly, Betsy has her Greening Communities program. And that offers, the municipalities buy into that program separately from the levy. And she coordinates getting trees out in lesser quantities to citizens. So in quantities, I think it's 20 quantities of 20. So that's an ideal program for, landowners that don't have large acreage, but they still want to plant trees. And we're willing to organize that for other municipalities too. So maybe I'll have Betsy follow up with you after the meeting.
I'll keep some of these things in mind as we go forward on some of these discussions. Thank you. Because we're going to be reviewing our strategic plan as well.
Okay, those comments, Jim, you were next.
Mr. Chair, first of all, kudos to the people who do the report, the watershed report. That's made up a lot of work, a lot of stats, very informative to read. And you can see all the things that you're trying to do to make it better. My question is, and I can't remember or not, is the watershed report card a monthly report card, quarterly or yearly?
It's released every 5 years.
Yes, it's big.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any further comments, John?
Through you, Madam Chair, this one's up my wheelhouse, so glad to hear the groundwater got a grade. We're doing all we can as an industry. Personally, there's always some folks that don't follow the rules out there, but we're through the Ontario Groundwater Association, Canadian Groundwater Association. We're doing all we can to make sure we protect that valuable resource. And I am aware now, but wasn't aware that the Elgin Clean Water Agency had stuff for decommissionings and whatnot. And there are very many times that if people get any bit of money to help towards decommissioning it, they'll help them do the right thing. If there's any bit of help along with the bill. So it's now that we're aware of that, we're making sure that when we see some applications to that.
That's great.
Thank you for those comments. Anything further, Todd?
Through you, Madam Chair. The report for the forest, is that just the wetlands, the forest and the wetlands, or is that through the watershed?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, the forest cover is its own entity and it's for the entire watershed, as well as the wetlands is its own evaluation and it's for the entire watershed.
Okay. And approximately how many trees would be in an acre of forest?
That, Betsy, if you're on the line, would you be able to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So as far as a mature forest, I don't know if I can speak to that, but as far as when we're planting, we plant about 800 trees per acre.
Okay, and then just one other question. If we were to clear cut a couple dozen acres of forest lands in our watershed, how would that affect our report card today?
Betsy, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know how it would affect the percentage, but in Elgin County, there is a tree cutting bylaw. So clearing does have a compensation associated with it. So it's a little trickier than that. And I will note, while we do tree planting year over year, those plantations aren't necessarily captured until they're a certain size as well. So that's something to keep in mind. It will take a number of years before our plantings actually are showing up and being mapped as part of this process.
So
Thank you for those comments, Betsy. Anything further? Then completely different from the comments that everybody else has made, I would like to thank Kettle Creek Conservation Authority for their public education on this item. The use of social media in order to keep the public constantly updated, because our greatest partners in this is our local partnerships that we have, especially with public. So I would like to give them, because they do post about the watershed and the watershed conditions on a constant basis on all the social media platforms. And that helps to get the public on our side, which is comments that everyone has made around the table. And I think that level of public education also translates, because the watershed report card is something that I know students, especially those in the environmental programs at our high schools, our local high schools, and those that are choosing to use that as career path, is something that they return to and take a look at on an ongoing basis. So if there are no further comments, can I get a mover for the report?
I do have a mover from Sam. I
Sam.
just didn't get a seconder.
Seconder, please. Frank? Okay, last call for further comments or questions.
Just a quick comment. When we plant trees, little saplings, or are they bigger?
They're seedlings,
Okay.
so typically, yeah, they're about this size or that size. The ones that go out in the greening communities are a larger sapling.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions or comments on the question then, all those in favor? Item carries. Next item is the permit update.
Thank you, Chair. With this advanced report, staff's looking at getting approval to make a minor administrative change to issuing section 28 permits for development associated with maintenance under the Drainage Act, as well as Hydro One network works within easement corridors. So just I'll try to briefly summarize the history. Some of you may be familiar with the DART protocol that was established a few years ago. It was a collaborative initiative between ministries, municipalities, conservation authorities to really streamline approvals for maintenance works under the Drainage Act. At that time, they developed what they call the DART protocol, and it established a series of standard compliance requirement forms that, as long as the maintenance works is to comply with those forms, it's a streamlined approval process. When that was first developed, similar to some of our neighboring CAs, Kettle Creek was not issuing section 28 permits under the Drainage Act. Although it was required, we were doing it through what we call letters of advice. So at that time, we also had agreements with Fisheries and Oceans Canada to represent the Fisheries Act for protection of fish and fish habitat. So as a transition, we agreed to continue to write letters of advice, but we would include requirements under the DART protocol. So we were still fulfilling the requirement. We were doing it through a letter of advice. As a result of Bill 23, it's kind of changed where we can no longer review and comment on Drainage Act applications for fish and fish habitat. We can only do it under our natural hazards mandate. So this kind of forced staff to relook at how we've been operating those approvals to date. Through that review, we just felt now's the time to jump to fully comply with the DART protocol and use those FCR forms as actual permits. So rather than writing a letter of advice and screening for application permits, staff would now just use those forms to sign off and return as an official permit under the Conservation Authorities Act. So as a result of that, we're recommending that the board approve those standard compliance requirement forms as section 28 permits for works under the Drainage Act. Secondly, the timing was consistent with Conservation Ontario has signed a memorandum of understanding with Hydro One. So Hydro One used to be considered a crown corporation, so they were exempt from certain provincial legislations for getting permits. Now that they're no longer considered that, they need to obtain section 28 permits for work they're doing within their hydro easement corridors that are affected by the regulation. So following on the successes of the DART protocol, they established their own standard compliance requirement forms as a way to streamline. So what we're asking in this report is that the board approve those standard compliance forms for both the DART protocol and Hydro One works, so that we can continue to issue them as section 28 permits and assist with the working relationship we've had with both those scenarios.
Moved by Jim, seconded by Sam. Any questions or comments to Joe? Please, John.
I think it was great that you're actually getting cooperation with such a huge utility. That's amazing. I wish that we would extend such complimentary
You have got.
work with the Drainage Act, is boy, are they being a bunch of, I'm not sure what I can call them.
It's being recorded.
Yeah, I know, that's why I'm watching, that's why I'm just going, I'm not on a drill rig, don't swear, don't swear. But, yeah, they are certainly not being cooperative whatsoever with the drains, and it's nice to see such a big entity showing in a lake wheelhouse in the same sort of big utility corridor such as railroads are. It's nice to see cooperation, and hopefully this lays the groundwork to show the railways what responsible corporations do.
Thank you for those comments. Jim, where's your hand up? Okay, any further questions or comments? Then calling the question, all those in favor? The item carries. Thank you, Joe. Next item, please.
Thank you, Chair. The last item is just the advanced summary activity report for approvals under the Planning Act by staff as well as Section 28 permits. So we're just looking for that report to be received, or I'm happy to answer any questions if any of the members have any.
Thank you. Mover and a seconder, Todd, second, John. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Item carries. Next item, please. We have a motion to go into closed session. Or
And actually, Chair, what I'm looking for is that we adjourn this meeting and go into the Kettle Creek Source Protection Authority meeting and then come back to the closed session. So we'll stand adjourned this meeting at 11:01 and start the source protection meeting.
training. We'll break for 1 or 2 minutes
Sure.
so that make sure we have everyone else.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Elizabeth.
We'll call the source protection meeting at 11:09. And Marianne, if we can go to the next slide. So the first motion that I would ask, and for the benefits of the new members, the Kettle Creek Source Protection Authority, we always treat as a separate entity. So it's very clear when we're doing authority business and when you're sitting as a source protection authority. So I would ask that we have a motion that the chair, vice chair, and all officers elected or appointed by the Kettle Creek Conservation Authority in 2023 serve in the same role for the Kettle Creek Source Protection Authority in 2023.
Need a mover, Frank, seconded by Sharon. Questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? That item carries. Next item.
So for the benefits of members, I just thought we'd do just a very quick overview of the source protection program and a little bit of an orientation on it. So the source protection program implemented in response to the Walkerton tragedy in May of 2000. It's aimed to have a very science-based, locally developed source protection plans on a watershed basis throughout the province, and specifically focusing on current and future municipal drinking water sources. Next slide. At the core of the source protection program is the implementation of source protection plans, and these are mandatory for all municipal residential drinking water systems within Ontario. Next slide. So when source protection began, they looked at the province, and there was already the conservation authorities organized on a watershed basis. And what they did is they grouped various conservation authorities that had similar basins into what we call source protection regions. So these are all the source protection regions across the province. And of course, we were linked to the Lake Erie source protection region. Next slide. Our region consists of Kettle, Catfish, Long Point, and Grand River, and together we're one of the largest source protection regions within the province. We have a large urban and small rural towns throughout the region, 55 municipalities, and a mixture of manufacturing, intensive agriculture, and complex overburden and bedrock geology. A good portion of the Lake Erie region has substantial growth expected or planned over the next few decades. The governance structure is somewhat complicated when you first come in, but it was basically dedicated. We're a little bit unique in the provinces. Right from the very get-go, we wanted the municipalities involved in our planning process, that it wasn't just the source protection authorities taking this on. So the key point to remember is that we have the 4 source protection authorities. We're guided by the Ministry of the Environment undertaking this work, but the Grand River Source Protection Authority is the lead source protection authority. They're the largest authority in our basin and the one that was well equipped in terms of staff and and expertise to take this source protection planning on. So just go briefly into the different elements of the governance structure. Next slide. So the ministry is at the top there. They're responsible for administering and implementing the Clean Water Act. Next slide. And then we have what's called the Lake Erie Regional Management Committee. And again, we didn't want everything led by Grand River. We wanted to work as a group. And so it was decided right back in the early days of source protection that we would have a regional management committee. And that consists of the board chairs of all 4 CAs, as well as the CAOs of the 4 CAs, and the source protection committee chair is a non-voting member. The role of that committee is basically to guide the whole source protection program for the entire region, coordinating the finances and making sure the resources are there to get their work done. We meet 3 to 4 times per year, and as if you remember at the January meeting, the chair is appointed to that committee by virtue of their position. Next slide. The implementation working group is behind that desire to have municipalities having a say in this program right from the get-go, right from the planning and the implementation. So municipal staff throughout the watershed sit on this implementation working group. They sit about 7 times per year, and they discuss the plan implementation. They feed information and act as a resource as well to the Grand River in terms of implementing and designing the plan as well. Next slide. Then we have the large source protection committee. There's about 25 people that sit on that committee. It encompasses the whole region, and it tries to represent that whole region. There's a chair that's appointed by the minister. There's 7 municipal reps, 7 economic sector reps, 7 public interest reps, and 3 First Nation reps. There are also 3 liaison positions, 1 from the ministry, 1 from the Source Protection Authority sits at the table, and a representative from the Public Health Unit sits at that table as well. They really guide the development of the source protection plans and the technique. They're kind of the local approval agency for these source protection plans, and they meet now about 4 to 5 times per year. Next slide. And then we come to you, the Source Protection Authority itself. We'll call a source protection meeting as required throughout the year to deal with business. Typically, the business that you will be dealing with is you'll be doing a final review on any of the documents that the Source Protection Committee feels is ready for submission to the province. So that would include plan updates. You would have a say in any appointments to the Source Protection Committee as well. Next slide. The source protection plans are what is at the heart of this program. There's 2 elements to a source protection plan. There's the assessment report. That's really the science behind the plans. It identifies the vulnerable areas. It's the technical component of those plans. The plan itself has basically 3 core documents. The explanatory document tries to explain the source protection plan and the science and the rationale behind the policy development in layman terms. Volume 1 of the source protection plan sets out the context for the overall plan, kind of gives you a guidance in terms of the characteristics of the watershed. And volume 2 is the policies itself. Next slide. When we're looking at establishing a source protection plan, the science is trying to determine where are the vulnerable areas in the source protection area. There are 4 main vulnerable areas that you might deal with in a source protection plan: wellhead protection areas, intake protection zones, high vulnerable aquifers, and significant groundwater recharge areas. The 2 that we deal with within the Kettle Creek watershed typically are the wellhead protection area and the intake protection zones. That's mainly because we have 2 sources of municipal drinking water within the source protection region or our authority. And that's the Belmont wellhead protections located in central Elgin in the village of Belmont. And here you see the wellhead protection area around those wells. So you have the WUPA A, which is in the red. That's the 100-meter zone around the wellheads. That's the most vulnerable area. The 2-year time of travel is the WUPA B, the yellow zone around there. You can think of that as if there was a contaminant, it would take about 2 years to travel to the source of drinking water. And then those wellhead protection areas just go out from there based on time of travel. Next slide. The wellhead that we have in Belmont, we're very lucky within the source protection, our source protection area region. The most vulnerable area of that well is actually owned by the municipality or the conservation authority. So it very much limits the significant drinking water threats in that area. And the area itself is basically a park. So there's very little. There was no significant drinking water threats identified early in the plan. And we've basically taken our policy direction is to prohibit anything that would be a significant drinking water threat in that area moving forward. So that's a very strong protection for that wellhead area. Next slide. So the next area of concern that we have in the watershed is the intake protection zone. This is the IPZ for the Elgin Area Primary Water Supply System. It's located down in Port Stanley and obviously feeds a large amount of the public within our region. You can see it takes a similar approach. So the IPZ1 is the area immediately around the intake. It's entirely in Lake Erie. The IPZ2 is the minimum 2-hour time of travel. So any contaminant within that teal color takes about 2 hours to get to that intake zone. And then there's an IPZ3 that's further upstream areas. Again, we were very lucky in terms of identifying significant drinking water threats in the IPZ area in our watershed. Next slide. There was only 2 identified, and they were at the drinking. Sorry, can you go back, Marianne? They were identified at the intake, at the Elgin Area Primary Water Supply System itself, and they've been managed through risk management plans. Otherwise, all other activities have been prohibited in those areas that would be a significant drinking water threat. Next slide. So after we've identified those vulnerable areas and possible drinking water threats, there's a policy toolbox that we look at to manage those risks. Education and outreach, they could be pilot programs or research, specific actions such as developing an emergency response plan, land use planning decisions to keep things out of certain areas that would be the threat. And then there's prescribed instruments that can be employed as well, such as nutrient management plans. Next slide. Part 4 policies deal with those part 4 policies deal with those prohibitions or developing risk management plans. So because we didn't have existing drinking water threats when we established our first source protection plan back in 2015, we chose a large portion of our policies focused on prohibition. So if there's not a drinking water threat there to begin with, we're going to prohibit anything that would become a drinking water threat in the future. Or in the case of the IPZ, risk management plans. The source protection plan addressed existing and future drinking water threats. We looked at a policy toolbox to determine what policies would be best and manage the risks in that manner. Next slide. So this is a typical policy that you will see in the source protection plan. And if you can just tap Marianne, there's some highlights that will come up on this slide. Each policy will have a purpose. So this policy is designed to ensure that this never becomes a significant drinking water threat. Where is it occurring? It's occurring at Central Elgin and Elgin Area Primary Water Supply Intake Protection Zone. What we're going to prohibit the handling and storage of fertilizer in quantities that would make it a significant drinking water threat. And finally, the action. So we're designating a prohibition on those activities in the IPZ. So every policy will kind of follow that same purpose, action, where, what scenario. Next slide. The first Kettle Creek Source Protection Plan was approved on January 1st, 2015 and put into implementation. And you can see when the other source protection plans were put in place for the rest of our region as well. Next slide. Today, we've had the plan in place now for over 7 years, I guess. And we're entering the stage where we're looking at maintenance of that plan. So where we're at right now is we're undertaking what's called a section 36 update. And basically that means that the minister has dictated at a certain period, we should go back into that plan, make sure it's still working, see if there's any updates, see if anything has changed. Next slide. So a section 36 update follows a certain protocol. There's pre-consultation where the assessment report and source protection plan are updated and presented to the Source Protection Committee for consideration. Where possible, there's a municipal endorsement, and then there's public consultation on those updates as well. Where the draft is put out for public consultation, and then the committee reviews any feedback that they get from the public before they release it to the Source Protection Authority for final submission to the minister for approval. Next slide. So we are currently working our way through that section 36 update with the aim to have it completed by September of 2023. Next slide. Oops. That's it. So I will further detail the section 36 update in a subsequent report. But that's a very high overview of the source protection plan and how you fit into it.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board members? Thank you very much for the presentation. Oh, sorry, John, go ahead, please.
As far as trying to mitigate problems for source protection. Belmont is like well protected, the wellhead's way up there. My father-in-law lives in Essex County. I'm not getting any more specific than that. And they had a fire at a agricultural supply place down there. And basically, when they had the fire, the runoff that was involved in that, there were berms, but then they had to clean up the water that was inside of the berms. That was costly, so got a backhoe, let her dangle, and there hasn't been a fish in this creek out back since. So I certainly don't want anything like that happening here. But ag supply places, and somewhere in here, I cannot find it in the report what they're reading. But it was dense, non-aqueous phase liquids. That one got my ear, and so anything that are like that anywhere in the watershed, for the rings around the well, I was like, how about one ring a little farther south that might be worthwhile making sure that, because those ag supply places, that's one of the only sources for that sort of contaminants. So I just wondered if there was any special sort of designation beyond what's in here. I just saw it wasn't in the Village of Belmont water supply area, so the protection zone.
Yeah.
I just wondered.
So if you're asking specifically about Dean apples is something that the committee itself has struggled with right since the get-go. My understanding of Dean apples is they can exist in fingernail polish, small portions of it. So it's found in a number of different products. The committee has struggled on the fact that the minister has never defined what quantity of Dean apples is a significant drinking water threat. So rather than to qualify the quantity of it, the committee took the perspective that they would prohibit it within the most significant zones. But we haven't looked at a policy beyond that, because we basically deal with the vulnerable areas. It has to reach a certain score for it to be considered that a policy needs to be developed at it. So our scope is really within those rings, not beyond those rings.
I saw that Port Stanley was also listed as a source protection thing. Same reason.
Yeah, the significant drinking water threat within the Port Stanley Harbor at the initial source protection plan was actually the storage of commercial fertilizer within the harbor. And that significant drinking water threat was removed when that company no longer existed. And then the prohibition took over. So there will never be that level of commercial fertilizer stored within that area in the future. It's prohibited.
And it was sort of along with the phosphate contamination. It's, well, spreading manure on field, but it's also raw sewage is the source of that. And well, when there's floods on Kettle Creek, sometimes the sewage plant in St. Thomas gets hit. And that heads down the creek and then west to east for Lake Erie's flow from the creek to the intake. So just wondered what long-term plans might be for any of that protection.
I can't really comment on that per se. I know that they did significant amount of studies in terms of looking at the assessment reports and the IP. Again, it's the threats within those IPZ areas. And so the IPZ3 only goes up a certain portion of Kettle Creek, and that's not captured in that. But I think we can be rest assured that Andrew Henry of the Elgin Area Primary Water Board and the Primary Water Board itself are constantly looking at risks to that water supply beyond what's identified in the source protection plan.
Any further comments or questions? Is there a motion to accept the report?
It was just an
FYI?
overview. Yeah.
Very good. And further,
So-
I need to go to post.
No, next slide, Mary Ann. So there are the minutes that we need to accept. So there's the minutes of the October 21st, 2021
Lake Erie.
Lake Erie Source Protection Committee, and the December 6th and October 4th Source Protection Committee meeting be accepted, in the minutes of the Lake Erie Regional Management Committee, October 16th, 28 be received.
Would you like 3 separate motions or one?
I think we can do all three at once.
Okay.
All three.
All 3 at once? Yes.
Yeah, I move all three.
Thank you, Jim, then Sam. Any further comments or questions on the minutes of those 3 separate meetings? Seeing none, all in favor? Item carries. Thank you very much.
And Chair, the final report was just to give you a brief update on the Section 36 update. So this, again, as I mentioned, is to ensure that the assessment report and source protection plans undergo a comprehensive review and update on a periodic basis. There's some minor updates to the assessment report, basically revisions to the characterization report, just bringing it up to date on current information of climate, surface and groundwater. And inclusion of climate change research. Next slide, Mary Ann. Updates to the source protection plan, again, was the addition of liquid hydrocarbon pipeline policies that's being considered across the province. The pre-consultation was circulated to affected municipalities, which included municipality of Central Elgin, and it will go out for public consultation beginning April 5th. To May 9th, and will be brought back to this, will be brought back to the committee, Source Protection Committee, and then to the Source Protection Authority for final submission to the ministry. But just an FYI that that's ongoing at this time.
Thank you. So no recommendation.
No recommendation.
Next item.
There was a matter of information, Chair, that you wanted to raise in regards to this bill in Ohio, as an information.
I just brought it forward as an FYI that some members of local councils have been receiving some inquiries about any impact to water or to the environment with the rail disaster that was happening in Palatine. So we did request and did receive a letter saying that there would be no impact to our water study. So if anyone would like, we can circulate that directly to them.
I'm glad it wasn't summertime.
Why?
Wind coming up, the Ohio Valley from the southwest, winter time, it's blowing from the north.
40 miles.
Yeah, it's just,
No, wow.
it's just the big.
That's it, everything was okay?
Well, I think as you're receiving inquiries, because there were members of the St. Thomas City Council that were receiving
All right,
some concerns. So we found out the information and I shared it with our conservation authority.
Winds in the right direction, right?
Well, thank you for that feedback. It's appreciated. Anything else?
That's it for source protection business for today. Just adjourn.
Adjourned by consensus, please. We now have a need to go into closed session.
Yes, we would reconsume the Conservation Authority and go into closed session,
Wait a second.
please.
Mover, chair, second, top. Questions or comments about going into closed? Seeing none, all those in favor? Carries. First item, please, session. Or do you
Chair
need
will
to-
just make
get them
sure that
vetted?
we're